40 minutes. So we're going to take about 40 minutes of your time, and we're going to be talking about data exchanges and data sharing across networks, something that Steve and I have both been interested in for some while. So, Steve, would you mind just briefly introducing yourself?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. My name's Steve Brewer. I'm two key roles. One is at the University of Lincoln, working the Lincoln Institute for Agri-Tech, looking at the food supply system, but also have my own business called Infoculture, where I'm sort of looking at digital transformation projects and implementing the kind of things we're going to be talking about today in various projects with businesses, government agencies, etc.
Right. Hopefully you can see my slides. I'm going to continue as though you can. So my name is Roger Maull. I'm from the Initiative for the Digital Economy at Exeter. So that's actually based in London. You may have heard that yesterday if you were on the call yesterday. So we're Index based in London, and I'm the academic director of Index. And today, Steve and I are going to talk about data sharing across networks, or maybe more concretely, we're going to be talking about data exchanges. Just very briefly, so 2 or 3 slides to start with on the background to our group. Index has 2 major industry-led projects, DigitLab, who are heavily involved in all these calls. You will hear speakers from DigitLab all week. And I'll talk very briefly a little bit more about DigitLab in a second. The second is our Defence Data Research Centre. In May, we won quite a strong competition to be DSTL's partner in defence data. You can find about this on ddrc.uk. So we have two big research awards, both really looking at the use of data and how data is transforming the way in which organisations operate. In particular, large established organisations, big organisations. We start as a group with this assumption that we're in a digital revolution. And being in a digital revolution, then the world is going to change. The society is going to change. The economy is going to change. All of these things are going to change. And so we're very keen to look at large companies and how they adopt digital technologies for the purpose of speeding that up. There's a couple of quick questions we always get whenever I do this talk, and I'm very happy to discuss them later. This whole differentiation between digitization and digitalization. Yep, as a group, we're particularly interested in the latter, digitalization. We're not particularly focused on how you digitize things, how you just computerize things. We're not particularly interested in that. What we are interested in is how adopting digital technologies actually transforms what you can actually do, transforms and enables different things, different ways of working. And the second question we often get is, what is digital for? I'm going to keep coming back to that because we always end up with this discussion. Is digital technology an end in itself? Of course it's not. It's used to enable productivity, improve sustainability, resilience, all those sorts of nice words. And we're going to talk a bit about that as we go through. So just a couple of slides on DigitLab itself. We have 4 areas we focus on: digital innovation, digital growth, digital impact, and together we consider they constitute digital transformation. So we're interested in things such as well-being. We're interested in how does the adoption of digital technologies affect individuals in their workplace. We're interested in this balance between adopting digital technologies for productivity and efficiency, while simultaneously trying to improve and trying to reduce carbon usage, improve energy usage. We're interested in those sorts of questions. So we recognize that digital is there for a purpose, and for us, it's very much around the sustainability agenda. DigitLab's the next stage digital economy research centre. That's lots of words there. It's actually quite important. The digital EPSRC has, which is the UK Research Council in Science and Physical Science, has 6 national centres in digital technology. One at Decade, which is at the University of Surrey, which is around blockchains. For example, there's one at Nottingham around privacy and security. There's one at Bath, which is around digital media, for example. We are the one which is on digital transformation. So we're the National Centre for Digital Transformation Research, looking at research insights, knowledge frameworks, knowledge transfer, practical techniques. So we're interested in things which make an impact. We're not just here theoretically to write academic papers, although of course we are interested in that. We're also interested in the impact. We work with large established organizations, as I've said, and we want to go beyond digitizing current products. And we've got 5 talks this week relating to the DigitLab Next Stage Centre. Today, Steve and I are talking about experiences with data exchanges. So now I've taken 10 minutes of your time. I'm going to get on and tell you what it's about. This is a slide which started, The Economist had this in about a front page in about 2017, I think it was, when it talked about data as the new oil. Well, I think most of us have decided data isn't the new oil, doesn't have the attributes of oil. It's a lot more fungible for a start, but it's certainly the new resource in the economy. And whereas The Economist was very interested in these big platforms, the Ubers, the Amazons, the Googles of this world, we as a research group have been interested in data and how it can fuel the entire economy, not just those big platform plays. So we're interested in large established organizations. There might be banks, there might be utilities, there might be manufacturing companies, there might be pharma companies, whatever. We're interested in how they use data and to see data as a new resource. And linked to that, and very much associated with that, was some work we did with a project that Steve and I worked on together called the Internet of Food Things. It was a project which took a farm to fork view of the food supply chain, so farm through to fork. And in its review, whenever we were looking at how the farm to fork worked and how bits of technology worked in different places in the supply chain, maybe in the retail, maybe in the farm, maybe in the supply chain or the logistics, very quickly we came up across this data issue. And we were sponsored by the Food Standards Agency to look at the whole idea of food data trusts. So how do organizations throughout that supply chain share data? That was the focus of the report. And we developed as a consequence of that a framework for information sharing. This report, which you can see here, this report, this food data trust report, can I do a pointer option? This food data trust here. This report is available from the Food Standards Agency or from Steve or I. We did quite a lot of work on this. Within it is a nice little framework for thinking about how you might do information sharing, particularly in a food context. The Food Standards Agency were keen on this, of course, because they, if there's a food scare, and Steve will probably talk a bit more about this, if there's a food scare, they need to very quickly identify where in the supply chain the problem has occurred. Where did it first manifest itself? Back to horse meat. Where was it in the supply chain it first manifested itself? What has it impacted? Can we identify exactly where in the supply chain it manifested itself? And they historically have done that through, literally hand-to-mouth paper-based systems. And they still want a system which enables them to automate that much more, so they can identify where the problems occurred in the supply chain initially. The second thing to say about this excellent report is that there's an appendix to the report, which, as Steve says, we probably ought to be included just within the major report itself, is about the legal structuring and governance of food data trusts. It's a report created for us through Pinsent Masons, the lawyers, and for anybody interested in data trusts and data exchanges, I thoroughly recommend reading this. It's a very detailed summary of some of the legal things that data trusts need to go through. So it's trying to say, okay, so how would it actually work? Legally, how would it work? How do we set one up? What are the questions we need to answer? And at the same time, whilst we've been interested in this, we've noticed a continuing interest or an expanded interest across all sorts of supply networks. It's not just food. So now a typical you know, a typical supply chain where you have a finished product here and you have suppliers and you have component suppliers, you know, and this might stretch all the way back. It becomes very big and very detailed and very complex, you know, and can be 3, 4, 5, 6 tiers easily. It's quite obvious that what happens is the visibility of this manufacturer, the finished product manufacturer, rarely extends beyond this point here. They see their supplier and rarely see their supplier's supplier. Now, there's been perhaps a number of reasons for that. Primary amongst that is efficiency. You know, it's not efficient to spend all your time trying to manage the entire network. A good thing to do is to leave this supply, you know, manage this supplier relationship, this buyer supplier relationship, and leave this relationship to that particular supplier. So, in other words, the network is managed by, you know, the receiving tier, the buyer tier, and it goes, you know, can go an awful long way back. There are maybe other reasons, some of which are changing very quickly. You know, historically, the cynic in me might suggest some people weren't very interested in knowing the supply chain network all the way back. Why not? Maybe they weren't terribly happy. You know, we know that Apple, when it started to investigate its supply network in China, met a number of practices it became very unhappy with, and suddenly had to start managing them. So in other words, there is this big complicated network, and that's what globalization, that's what the big push was for 20 years. And it was all about cost. We minimized cost, we developed great relationships here, and we had very efficient systems and very lean systems. And then suddenly come along 2 other challenges, just pre-pandemic and obviously more strongly post-pandemic. Pre-pandemic, we had all this stuff about environmental. You know, we were actually trying to understand if this company here is trying to understand all its emissions, its scope 3 emissions, then it's got to get all the way back to understand how they work. So it needs to understand how its whole network works. And more so if it's interested in its labor practices, in its employee welfare, all the way back down the supply chain, it needs to know. So from a situation where organizations weren't needing to know, suddenly they started to need to know. And it's become a big challenge. And it's become a big challenge also because of this notion of resilience. You know, if we're going to have resilient supply chains that are resilient to disruption, we need to know where our supplies are in that whole chain. We need to know where the most critical component parts are in that supply chain so we can monitor them and manage them. If we don't know where they are, the unexpected occurs, supply doesn't occur, stops production. There are so many stories right now that are occurring. Almost all procurement managers I talk to have a major supply challenge somewhere. So we've got lots of companies trying to get their head around how they understand how the supply chain network works in the first instance. And there's lots of stories. Japanese semiconductor firm, you can read about this on the web. More than 100 people working for more than a year to map its supply chain following the tsunami 10 years ago. So huge, great problem. British manufacturer right now, a name known to everybody on this call, I'm sure. It's got over 50 people currently mapping its supply chain because it needs to understand, you know, it needs to make it more resilient. And the problems become that the mindset is this classic one, you know, this classic old joke about the policeman who finds the person looking underneath the light for their keys. I'm searching for my keys. And the policeman says, did you lose them there? No, I dropped it, you know, around the corner. Why are we looking here? Because the light is better here. That old joke is really a great summary of what's going on. The manufacturers are looking where they know to their buyers. They aren't looking all the way back down the supply chain. And thus, the challenges of resilience, sustainability, better employee practices, until those whole networks are managed, they become a problem. So that's the first challenge. Once we start understanding that network, we need to start building the data exchanges and data trusts. And for us, that framework, that report I mentioned for the Food Standards Agency, it has 3 major legs in it. So it has a leg around governance, which Pinsent Mason's talked about. So, you know, it's trying to say, how do we manage those relationships between those multiple parties in that network? How do we manage the exchange of data? Secondly, how do we incentivize people to get engaged in sharing data down through a supply chain? Because Now, there's a cost associated with it. So we need to incentivize people. And thirdly, we need to think about the technology, the way in which we enable the sharing of the data. And it's a bit like a three-legged stool. I think those are the three component parts. It's well described in that FSA report. They are three component parts. And it's like a bar stool in that if you actually go too far on one, it wobbles and ultimately falls over. The three have to be held in sync. And whilst the technology one is the one that people often talk about and gravitate towards, the other two are equally as important and actually, in my view, extremely challenging. We can sort out incentives. We can sort out incentives if we build them in within the governance mechanism. We can incentivize people to play as part of the supply network and share data if we sort it out as part of the governance mechanism. And historically, we need to recognize that not all these things are legal. Not all these things are transactional. Not all these things are like a legal contract. The formal transactional contracts tend to be around arm's length relationships, the use of power, creation of enforceable contractual obligations. If you do something wrong, you are subject to a penalty. And it's, typically aim for complete planning, complete contracting. Contracts should cover all future events, absolutely impossible things. Those are the formal relational contract mechanisms. On the right-hand side of this model is the more informal ones, where we've got the relationship is important. The partnership amongst the parties is important. How they work together is importantly. We recognize social norms. We recognize the ways in which different organizations in different contexts and different cultures work. We avoid risk through creating an alignment of interests. And all those things here, the 9 principles of relational contracting are very important. So Pinsent Mason said, okay, how will this work? Well, basically, you've got two choices. You have multiple organizations with multiple individual data sharing agreements amongst those parties. So you've got 3 companies and they've all got a one-to-one individual data sharing agreement. The alternative, of course, is to form a data sharing entity like a club. And like a club, it has some rules, some formal rules and informal rules about the way in which things work. So we're talking about data sharing agreements amongst multiple parties and forming a club. And that club, the whole purpose of that club is to engender trust, like any club. And we are sharing data. So we're sharing something which we all recognize as the new oil, which has economic value in itself. So we are sharing something which is important. This isn't just something where we can have some general rules. We need to have some specific rules. And we do it to create a trusting relationship amongst the parties. It's not just the formal contract, it's the soft, informal contracting as well, the relational contracting, which is important. But recognizing that trust has 3 major components. It's about competence individuals, competence of organizations to do what they say they will do. And often that's through standards, ISO standards, for example. Secondly, integrity, that you trust that organizations will do it according to the rules and according to the way in which the contract's been established and been written down. And thirdly, benevolence, often the one which is overlooked. Benevolence, this concept of where a party works to the benefit of you will not be seeking to exploit an opportunity to lower your gain to their benefit, are benevolent in the way in which they act to you. So the data trusts, the data exchange is trying to engender trust. And governance mechanisms are best done through institutional mechanisms, third parties. So these clubs for us are third-party mechanisms, institutional mechanisms. And examples of institutional mechanisms include things like escrow accounts. So whenever you're moving house, and you're paying £500,000, you don't pay £500,000 to the seller. You put it into, a lawyer who puts it into an escrow account, so an intermediary, a third-party account where the money is held until the contracts actually take place. The contractual exchange actually takes place. Visa are an institutional mechanism. They act as this intermediary between the buyer and the commercial agent. so that they, hold the money, so that, if there's a dispute, you can contact Visa and Visa will act on your behalf. In other words, there's a third party in this relationship. Blockchains enable it, blockchains themselves, I don't believe are institutional mechanisms. They enable institutional mechanisms, they enable trust. But the whole argument is about trusted third-party agents. So data exchanges are about this third party, like the escrow account in this picture, this third party which enables two other parties to exchange information. So finally, before I hand over to Steve, what we're about. As a group, we're very interested in this notion of clubs, sets of rules, sets of ways of working, where we're exchanging data. So a data exchange for us is the governance mechanism is like a club. Sets of rules, where there are penalties for non-compliance. There are also membership terms. There are different ways in which you can become a member. You can become a full member where you exchange data. You can become a member, which is about benchmarking and seeing how other organizations do what you're interested in, or you can just be an observer status. So we recognize that clubs, like all clubs, there are very frequently different levels of membership. So in this data exchange, we recognize there'll be different levels of membership. And there'll be penalties for non-compliance and rules around how you share data. So hopefully that's given you an overview of what we're interested in terms of data exchanges. I'm just going to pass you over to Steve, who's going to do a little bit more on, I'll stop sharing now, Steve. Oh no, in fact, I'll continue sharing because I'm going to run your slides.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Roger. That presents it presents is a great overview of what we've been doing with these various projects and reports in recent years and how we've got to where we are. So I fully endorse all of that. That all helps clarify that. Apologies for the ambulance in the background. I think the two things it's worth, one thing it's worth saying to just build on what you've been saying before we move to the next slide is just to clarify the thinking between a data trust and a data trust framework.
Yeah.
I know we do get bogged down a lot of jargon, a lot of buzzwords, a lot of key terms, and in a sense we've tried to remove a lot of that by using language like clubs to simplify that process.
Yeah.
But just to clarify this conceptual difference, data trust, which in some ways is more widely recognized, is really the classic pooling of data for the greater good. So you often see that in smart cities, medical research, where there's a sort of an overarching goal to make the city efficient, to cure cancer or something. Let's pool a lot of data together, allow people to interrogate that data, and we can do good things. That is in fact where we came into the Food Standards Agency report, that the request really was to look at this as a potential option to look at food safety. But what we found quite swiftly once we started to talk to organizations in the food industry, the food sector, was they absolutely were not going to be open to sharing data. And to the point of being really quite aggressive about this. It was really quite shocking, the perspective. And that's entirely right. It's not a wrong position to have. So that led us down the research of looking at ways of overcoming this, where we discovered examples of trust frameworks, where essentially the participating organizations retain control of, ownership of, responsibility for their data, and the trust framework is the mechanisms, including with third parties, as Roger's explained, the mechanisms for sharing and exchanging that data. And this is essentially what the club is. And just before we move on as well, the other thing Roger mentioned about not being able to sort of peer back into supply chains, particularly in the food sector, that is actually a recognized convention, if not legally based. They refer to it as one up, one down. You know where things are going and where they've come from. That's your responsibility, unless something untoward goes on, in which case, obviously, the investigation has to happen, which can, to be fair to the food industry, happen quite swiftly, but it's clearly a cumbersome process to dig back. That said, nobody's going to pay for a system that does all of that just in case something goes wrong, because nobody wants to admit that. So this comes back to Roger's point about benefits. There has to be real, clear, tangible benefits immediately in participating in such a solution, not just, well, it could be useful if something goes wrong. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So this is the conceptual model that emerged from this chunk of research that Roger was referring to. This is in fact this sort of slightly more complex picture of the three-legged stool, and those three legs are the operations, you know, the benefits. What do I do? Why am I doing this? The governance, and the technology, the interoperability. How does the data get shared? The interoperability obviously happens through the use of standards, the use of APIs, application programming interfaces, mechanisms whereby there's an agreed protocol, if you like, for exchanging data between different systems, and some kind of communications interface in the most general sense of the word of how organizations implement that interoperability. We like the word protocol, which sort of covers all of this. You know, what are the protocols that enable organizations to make data accessible, to consume data? Operations, we've called it members, resource catalog, services, all the business elements that would need to be agreed between different organizations to implement that exchange of data for various reasons. And then the governance, we called it governance. One of the things that we learned subsequent to the reports that Roger's mentioned is really there's two levels of governance. There's sort of operational governance. How do you actually govern those exchanges of data? And indeed the legal aspects, as well as the rules of engagement, would have to go to govern that, so that there was agreed ways of operating, especially if you're accessing other people's data, which would also state clearly what you can do and what you can't do with data. So you may be able to access it for certain reasons, but you can't harvest it, you can't resell it, etc. So those are the key elements of the conceptual model of a trust framework, which we drew from various examples, such as the open banking entity model, iShare, a scheme for the Dutch trade in and out of the port of Rotterdam, and things like that. And yes, what came from the Pinson Mason's legal perspective is it's really useful to have a not-for-profit legal entity at the heart of this, because that provides you with a root, a keystone from which everything else can spin off. Otherwise, you end up with multiple legal agreements between many parties, which is quite challenging to scale up. Next slide, please. So the other aspect, the mirror side of the conceptual model is how does this get implemented, managed in reality? This is the simplified version of that, if you like. The key point is that there's two tiers. This model was derived from various examples we've seen. We looked at where this is happening in real life. Essentially, what you've got at the top is your federation of organizations that are participating in the scheme, and below you've got the foundation, the entity that's actually executing the operations on behalf of that wider community. So the key point, the key thing that's happening is that the wider membership has an influence, to whatever degree is decided, on the implementation of the system. So that's what's going on. You have this council of participants, representation of the federation, and they, if this was a large group, would appoint a supervisory board. If it was small, it could act in that capacity themselves, and that in turn supervises the executive board of the organization. And this would be the legal entity, not for profit, typically, that implements that. There's obviously various variations on that, and we looked at different examples of this in real life. And this is what we're sort of seeking to develop in a number of projects at the moment to take it further forwards. So this is the heart of the data trust framework governance model. Next slide, please, Roger. Well, that's it. I mean, that's the overview of what we've done. We've looked at this in various examples. We looked at food safety. We did a project looking at honey authenticity, which sounds quite kind of small scale, but it's actually a very good example of a very challenging subsector of the food system. There's lots of rules and regulations about what honey is, what you can do with it, but also there's lots of different interpretations of how those rules be applied. And that's why our approach is potentially very useful in providing a mechanism for the community to work collaboratively to address those different perspectives and develop a working solution. And we're doing this at other areas too. So this was the final slide. I mean, Roger and I are both open to questions, but in the absence of any immediate questions, we thought there's some interesting questions to ask of you in terms of what your reflections are on what we've said, and how it relates to your experiences of collaboration in distribution systems.
Thanks, Steve. We have a number of questions. John Beard asks an interesting question. Which sectors do you see as being furthest ahead with data exchanges? We've predominantly been interested in the food sector, as you'll probably be aware. You might want to comment on that as well, Steve, because you've been more involved in it than I have. Over the last month, there's some work going on at the Digital Catapult, which Steve and I are engaged in, which is looking at data exchanges for the small modular reactor, and actually across 3 or 4 different parts of manufacturing right now. So you can ask us about that more directly. We can point you to the people who are engaged in that. We're interested in the data governance for that.
Yeah. Well, what I would say is that the solution, I believe, is applicable to that full spectrum that you indicated on your earlier slide, from quite rigid hierarchical relationships to very dynamic, fast-moving ecosystems of supply, where you've got groups of organizations that want to achieve either thing. And as we've discussed, we're both involved in this project with the Digital Catapult, who are developing, moving towards test beds for supply chains, and are very conscious that the governance question is applicable to all areas.
Yeah.
And that's something that we're looking at and seeking to further articulate into how that would work. So yes, we've looked at food for the reasons we've said. It's interesting, it's quite dynamic. It's traditionally not looked up and down through the tiers, but the approach works for different areas. You probably need different groups of people working collaboratively to solve them, but the flexibility is there, I believe.
We are also aware that the UK government has an initiative in this area to share data amongst government departments, for both public and private good. So Steve and I have been involved in 1 or 2 of those discussions as well. There's plenty going on at the Cabinet Office, isn't there, Steve? You were involved in those discussions. Yeah,
I mean, an interesting point as a sort of aside, when we started looking at this with the Food Standards Agency, which is obviously a government department, we'd sort of naively assumed that we were looking at the sharing and exchange of data between businesses and government as a single entity. And what you soon realize, if you've had any dealings with government, is it's very far from being a single entity. There's nothing wrong with that, but the mechanism has equal number of benefits for different departments who have completely different remits. We're doing work with the HMRC, the Cabinet Office, Food Standards Agency, all of whom have different reasons for interrogating and consuming data, and they have their own very tight rules and regulations about what they can do with it. Between data that's been collected for tax reasons can't simply be passed on to the food agency and vice versa. So having such a model is applicable there as well.
We have a question from Alan Brown too, which is always a nice tricky one. Would you expect the data sharing mechanism, the mechanism by which I'm understanding, Alan, the means by which it's shared, the data sharing mechanism to be heavily dependent on the type of data and the sharing scenario? You might want to give me two extremes. I think it will be. I think we are currently in a project which we haven't referred to, and I don't think we're allowed to refer to, where the data sharing mechanism is amongst multiple private companies, and the means by which that data is shared and the access of that data is obviously highly confidential amongst those parties. The data they're prepared to share is really a thorny point, even though I think, to be fair, we ourselves aren't sure, the people involved in the project aren't terribly sure exactly what we want, but we won't know until we get to look at those databases. I'm trying to be careful about what I say here, Steve,
yeah, that's fine. I think if I've understood Alan's question, yes, things will be different, definitely. And one of the sort of founding principles of the original work, which you will recall, is that we set out to be technology agnostic. It is very much a framework for the sharing and exchange of data. How you do it is entirely up to you. And indeed, as an example, one of the solutions we're working on, whilst some participants might be looking for quite a convoluted API to sort of dig into the heart of their system, others might just want something to connect to an Excel spreadsheet to, squirt data out or import it simply. Others might still be working at the level of, sharing PDFs, and we develop protocols to extract data from the PDF. So it's entirely up to the participating organizations. And I think the other thing that's worth saying is there's huge sensitivities in sharing of data, which until you start doing it, you don't realize. So the idea that you're going to develop a system which is just going to be plug and play across supply chains, I don't believe is going to work. Even within food, there's sectors, fresh produce, meat, etc. And people in those areas, they don't talk to each other in their lifetime. They're just different.
Yeah.
And what we realized, another thing, as well as the reluctance to share, people were very sensitive about their IT systems. So they didn't want even to reveal anything that might reveal what their IT system was.
Yeah.
It might just be a computer in the corner of the office with an Excel, or even less. So there's big sensitivities in that. So the technology is absolutely going to be different to organizations, even at different points in supply chains. It's not about the technology, it's about the permissioned sharing and exchange of data.
I think more generally, Alan's question is getting us at what different types of data exchanges will there be, and what's the variable that sort of helps us understand each type A, type B, type C, type D, and how it will work. I think that, to be fair, we are not there yet. We are still exploring this in 3 or 4 live use cases. We aren't in a taxonomy situation yet.
No, I think that's a good question that we should track and revisit sort of annually, because the way I see it, that there could be data exchange for lots of different specific industry sectors that have different
possibly legislative or regulatory reporting needs as well.
It will depend on the regulatory regime. So we've got used to food, and there's regulatory regime there. There's tax aspects. There's other solutions where we're looking at might serve a region or a more community-based approach, smaller businesses. Others might be larger ones. I think so what will be interesting is we start to implement or see implemented different versions, different instances, different scales. What are the commonalities and what are the differences? I envisage that there will be commonalities, that there will be not a meta framework, but mechanisms to support instances of data trust frameworks. And sort of what gets to the heart of Alan's question is, what are the commonalities that they will all be looking to consume?
I think that's right. We have a question from Kyle Alves, asking if there are lessons to be learned from organisations like the ONS about permissioned views of data. Yeah, I think that's a big one. I think we've all, and the Pinsent Masons people have always had this view that it would be permissioned data. You know, part of the club is to say what data is to be shared under what conditions and for what returns and all sorts of, you know, we have a series of like 25 questions, Steve and I, and they are things that enable us to build permissioned views of who can have access to what.
It's all about permissioned views of data. And it's not just a question of what you can see, what subsets, but what, for how long and what you can do with it. So, you know, you can see this for a period of time, and then that gets turned off. And the deal is that you don't save this, you certainly don't further exploit it. And this is where the club view works, in the sense that it's not as simple as kicking you out of the club, but there's sanctions, you know, there's fines, you know, there's penalties.
Exactly.
And that's the purpose of the communal approach.
John Beard makes a great comment about, I have seen organisations reluctant to share simply because of the confidence in the quality of the data in their databases. Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I
think that's the same as my point about the systems. You know, it's the state of your data. And that's part of this permissioning thing that you see snapshots. We did spend quite a lot of time looking at different semantic ontologies of data and how that might be done. Obviously, the reality is that it's a very imperfect world, and any solution has to be done pragmatically. You're certainly not going to be in a situation where organizations have to, you know, tidy up and recatalog all of their data before they can join.
Yeah, exactly.
But one of the things we did discuss or look at is, assuming that all of this works and is of perceived benefit to organizations, they might over time think, well, actually, if we adopt a common ontology about how we capture our data, we can see more business benefits in the future because that can be shared more easily. More knowledge can be derived from that in a shared sense, etc. So it's a direction of travel rather than a requirement. But I think it's a good point.
It's 1:45. Anybody got any more questions? Whilst you're thinking about that, Steve and I are very much still working on this. It's something very live for both of us. It's part of my research world, part of Steve's consulting world. We think we've got loads of interest currently from people who are talking about how you technically build data exchanges, but also around, you know, what's this club look like? How do we set up a club? How do we make it work? What's the benefits for everybody? Give us some examples. So that's a live thing. Any more? Feels like an auction here. If not, I'll say thank you for listening in. If you've got any interest, reach out to us. We'll help in any way we possibly can. Please feel free to send other Steve or I an email. It's you know, we are, as I said, we're actively engaged in it. Today we both said we'd be very interested in the questions, very interested in the insights we get from the questions. It's such a big interest area right now, and I think it has. It started from things like sustainability, resilience, are all making it a really big issue.
Yes, it's significantly transformed since we started on this journey. For various reasons. Resilience.
All right.
Okay.
I'm going to call a halt and say thank you very much. Same time, same back channel. I think it's 1 o'clock tomorrow. And we'll see you then. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Do get in touch if you have any questions.
Yep.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.